Jay here, and join me as I go through half of this stack of White Dwarf magazines, from the February 2019 issue through issue 458. I look at new rules for Outlaw Brutes, new terrain rules, a mini-campaign, Perpetual Campaigns, and more. This is part 1 of my 2-part series on Necromunda articles in White Dwarf magazine. This time, on JD in the Sump Sea. I want to start off by saying that all these White Dwarf magazines are available on eBay, or you should be able to find them on eBay, and they're usually not that expensive, between $5 and $10 usually at the most. So these rules are not that difficult to come by, luckily. I don't believe any of these rules have been reprinted in the rulebook that went up for pre-order the day of the recording of this video. So, White Dwarf, February 2018, there is a scenario. It's called the Gauntlet. This scenario uses the Badzone Delta tiles, and it is a Zone Mortalis style game. There's attackers and defenders. The attackers are known as the runners, and the defenders are known as the hunters. This scenario has rules for whether you're playing this in a campaign or whether as a one-off skirmish. So you want to set up the battlefield as shown on page 111. In this scenario, it says that all the doors begin closed but not locked, with the exception of the vault door. So the objective for the attacker is to break into the vault and open the loot casket, retrieving the chrono crystal. The defender's objective is to stop all the runners by putting them out of action. The attacker deploys first. You deploy all your runners anywhere in the shadowed area of the unlit crossroads tile. That is the tile to the far right on page 111. The defender then deploys their hunters as detailed in the From the Shadows Below section. The attacker has priority. The attacker also goes first. So the fighters that are deployed as lurking in shadows are not active, and they have no effect on the game until they're deployed. So when is the defender's turn to activate a fighter, they can choose to either pass, taking no action, or they can activate a fighter as normal, a ready fighter as normal. You move a fighter from the shadows onto the battlefield, placing it anywhere on the battlefield 1 inch away from an enemy, or send a fighter back into the shadows, removing them from the battlefield. Fighters placed from the shadows are not ready, and they must wait until the following round to take actions, and fighters engaged by enemies may not be sent back into the shadows. What's interesting is this scenario also says that nobody needs to make bottle tests. And both players get 2 tactics cards, and the battle ends when one of the runners opens the loot casket in the vault, or there are no runners left on the battlefield. If the attacker claims the chrono crystal, then they are the winners, otherwise the defender is the winner. So both sides are assumed to be involved in the gambling, so there's also rewards for campaign only, and there's gambling on this. So the outcome of the run, they gamble on the outcome of the run, so they would get 10 credits for each opposing ganger or juve taken out of action, 20 credits for opposing champions taken out of actions, and 40 if the opposing leader is taken out. The attacker can also sell the chrono crystal if they get it for 2d6 times 20 credits, or hold on to it, as it might be useful at some point in the future. Taking part in a Rust Town run is not about territory, and so no turf changes hands in this scenario. So that is the Gauntlet. It's actually kind of a neat game, even if it's just a one-off. You could always replicate these tiles. You don't have to have the Badzone Delta tiles necessarily. You could set up some sort of board that is similar to this and make all sorts of traps. It'd be a fun kind of scenario. But anyway, yeah, that's the Gauntlet, the Rust Town Run. That was White Dwarf from February 2018, the first one that we're looking at. The next one we're going to look at is from April 2019. Now, this White Dwarf doesn't actually have any rules. This is the one exception to my video here. This one doesn't actually have any rules. So this one, though, has some pretty neat stuff. I thought it was kind of a cool one to include in this video. These are all rather, most of these magazines, at least the first part of the video, are older ones. So this is like kind of closer to when Necromunda first came out in 2017 and 2018. So they kind of want to just introduce people to the game and what it is and what it means to play Necromunda. So this first part of the Necromunda coverage of the White Dwarf goes through the art of the Underhive. It shows different house heraldry, some very cool icons, and then that large ambot as well at the beginning. And then the next couple of pages, there's some artwork from gangers from the different houses, starting with Eschers, and then there's a Goliath, a couple of Orlocks, and a Van Saar, Caudor, and then Dalak. And then the next section is actually a battle report, and this is a really cool battle report. This terrain, I believe, is terrain at Warhammer World. There's 4 different gangs involved in this, and they're all bigger than 1,000 credits. None of these are starting gangs, basically. The first gang is the Hired Guns, Jerico's Profiteers. This one's really cool because they're all bounty hunters. So it's just a bunch of bounty hunters, named bounty hunters. The next gang is the House Orlok Sump Dogs, and this actually has Slate Merdena and his dog Macula, which are some great Forge World minis. It's like really neat looking gang. Next gang is the House Goliath, the Iron Lords, and this gang is cool because you've got an Ambot in there and a Sump Croc. Also, the Sump Croc's also from Forge World, so it's a neat looking gang. Then you have House Dalak, the Silent Ones, and this one also has the Ortrum 8-8. That's another Forge World character model. So all these gangs are larger than 1,000 credits, so they're not starting gangs. But it's definitely some interesting inspiration. You get to see how gangs are built, how different people build gangs differently, and I've always found that interesting. Seeing how other people build their Necromunda gangs. That's something that I've always been really interested in looking at. And so this article can give you some interesting inspiration for how gangs can be built. And then, of course, it's this really cool deployment, page next, and the terrain in this is just fantastic. It's definitely worth a look, definitely worth a read if you're into cool terrain and you're into, cool gangs and battle reports. I don't know. This stuff is one of the reasons I used to get White Dwarfs back in the 90s when I first started playing Warhammer, was stuff like this. So, yeah, there's the battle report, and after the battle report, you've got a story, the Tale of Jerico. And I mean, how great is this, too? Introducing people who've probably never heard of Jerico to the Jerico character. He's one of the coolest, most iconic characters in all of Necromunda. And he's just so cool. And yeah, you've got a story about him. So it's pretty cool. So that's basically White Dwarf April 2019. It's not got a bunch of rules, but it's got some neat background and a cool battle report. All right, next we're going to look at May from 2019. So the May 2019 White Dwarf has rules for Perpetual Campaigns. So Perpetual Campaigns are basically campaigns that continue on. They won't stop just because we've played through, say, 6 or 7 weeks of a campaign cycle. So in this article, they describe ways that you could have campaigns continue beyond those first, say, 6 or 7 weeks. One way to do it would simply be to loop the campaign phases. So in a Dominion campaign, you would have an occupation and then a takeover phase separated by a downtime phase. You could simply loop that over and over again. That's one of the suggestions in here. Another suggestion in here is, like, when playing a Dominion campaign, they could refresh the territories during the cycle downtime. So if territories are refreshed, they retain a number of territories limited by their gang rating. Each player may retain one territory of their choice for each full 1,000 credits of their gang rating. The rest of their territories would be lost. They also talk about house patronage. So there are the gangs could get patronage from their houses, and so there could be benefits. There's a table that lists the house patronage benefit and the credit cost of that benefit. Something that's very cool actually is page 129. They have the semi-perpetual Dominion campaigns. They have the triumphs that were gained by a gang, and then the benefits that that gang would get in the next campaign if you splinter the gang for the next campaign that you play that gang in. In a perpetual campaign, as gangs get larger, the number of fighters will increase, and this could result in one gang having an unmanageable amount of fighters at once. So the arbitrator could place a limit on the maximum number of fighters a single player could field in a scenario with unlimited custom crew selection. And there is on page 130 a chart showing the maximum crew size with a maximum gang rating next to it. This article also talks about underdogs. What's interesting is not only is the underdogs talked about here, but then they also talk about overpowered gangs and going out in a blaze of glory. So a gang that might be higher than a limit at the start of the campaign, they talk about the arbitrator creating a cap of a gang size credit-wise during a campaign. So let's say a gang gets above 4,000 credits. Well, that would be it for that gang. So an arbitrator would decide that at the beginning of the campaign, and any gang that gets up to 4,000 credits, they're done. And they go out in a blaze of glory. And going out in a blaze of glory, they'd play one last scenario. And there's this scenario here called Escape the Hive on the next page 132. And this is a very cool scenario because this overpowered gang has now decided, well, it's time to go. We're too good for these people. And they're trying to get to a ship to take off from off-planet. So that's basically what this is about. It's a very, very cool scenario. Very unique, I think, in Necromunda too. So the defender in this scenario is the arbitrator or another player or a number of players in the campaign. Potentially the rest of the players in the campaign if that one gang got big enough and there's enough other players to want to do this. It's basically the retiring gang versus everyone else. So use the standard battlefield setup at Sector Mechanicus. You set up the table like the picture on page 132 in White Dwarf, and they take turns placing terrain. Objectives. The attacker is just trying to get to the ship, trying to escape Necromunda for a new life somewhere else in the stars. The defender is trying to stop them. It is so interesting. White Dwarf is the place for scenarios like this. Just really unique scenarios and really unique articles that can help inform your games and your campaigns of Necromunda. I really hope they continue to put good articles like this in White Dwarf. Alright, let's move on to the next one. Next White Dwarf is October of 2019. There were a lot in 2019. So this White Dwarf's article is Assault on Precinct-Fortress 17. This is a mini campaign and it pits the enforcers against a group of outlaw gangs or a gang or gangs. And the way it works is the enforcers have a fortress that they're defending. They're the defender, and they agree with the attacker how many scenarios they're going to play. So there's 5 scenarios in this White Dwarf magazine, in this article. You play the first scenario always. Then you pick how many scenarios you're going to play between the first and the 5th scenario. So you could agree that you're going to play 1 or 2 or 3 scenarios. If you play just one scenario, then it puts the pressure on the attacker to overwhelm the defender sooner and with fewer opportunities to whittle down the precinct's defenses, and so it's more challenging for the attacker. If you play with 2 optional scenarios, then it's about even as far as the attacker and defender are concerned as far as difficulty. If you play 3 scenarios, then it's actually more difficult for the defender to win the campaign. So once you do that, once you decide how many games you're going to play, you build your crews. The enforcers get 1,500 credits. When you build the terrain, you need to have a section for prisoners that can be released by the attackers. The attackers are 3,000 credits. You can play with more than 2 players. So if you play with more than 2 players, then the additional players joining the attacking side, and the attackers divide the 3,000 credits and 20 rep evenly between themselves. So you also have assault waves. So the attacker can have multiple assault waves against the defender. There are rally points for the defenders with medical assistance and reloads. It tells you how to deal with lasting injuries, recoveries, medical escorts. So it's a great mini campaign that can be played over the course of an afternoon with, 2 players or 3 or even 4 players. And it's a pretty neat thing. Again, another great article that could only be in a White Dwarf magazine. Alright, the next White Dwarf we're going to look at is December 2019. So in this White Dwarf, there are actually 2 articles. The first one is called Return to Zone Mortalis, and this one is giving new rules to some of the new terrain that they released. Basically expanding the 2D Zone Mortalis to 3-dimensional. So it also talks at the very beginning of the article about how players should agree whether you can climb over walls or on top of columns or not. Whether it's basically flat, if there's an imaginary roof, or if there's not an imaginary roof. And this kind of harkens back to the old Forge World days when Forge World made the Zone Mortalis tiles, and that was for Horus Heresy. And before that, I believe was they had rules in 40k for the Zone Mortalis tiles for the Bad Ab War, was when they first came out with the rules and those terrain pieces. So this new is walls and columns that they made in plastic with those plastic tiles is based on off those original Forge World tiles. So this article kind of goes through and talks about how you should determine if there's going to be a ceiling or not, if it's 2-dimensional or not, basically. If it's 3-dimensional and you want to use lifts or stairs or anything like that, they've got the rules in here for doors and control panels and ductways. These are some expanded rules that are not in the main rulebook. There's toxic sludge, stills, floor hatches, pitfalls, protein reclamators. These are definitely new optional rules you could use to interact with the terrain that you have. Now the second article in here is called It's Made of People, and this is Mark Bedford building a protein reclamator piece of terrain for Necromunda, and it's a very cool article. If you like reading about building terrain, this is a very neat article. So anyway, that is December 2019. Alright, the next issue is issue 453, and this issue has an article called Back from the Dead. So, has death got you down? Has your leader, champion, or favorite gang member caught a bolt round to the skull, a chainsaw to the neck, or fallen from an extreme height? Are they in dire need of technological, alien, or supernatural intervention? Well, if so, then read on. That is how the article starts. So basically, this is the Necromunda Resurrection Packages article. So the way this works is if one of your gangers, champions, or leaders dies for some reason, you can talk to your arbitrator about possibly bringing them back. Now this is if you roll a 66 on the lasting injury chart and they're dead. There's 8 different resurrection packages that you could pick from. The arbitrator might simply arbitrarily pick one of these and say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. Or the player could be like, well, I feel like my guy should have demonic possession, should be the way he comes back. And then you and your arbitrator would work out how that would happen. But anyway, that's basically what this is. It's a great way to keep gangers in the fight that you really like if they die before they should. And that's issue 453. Alright, now we have issue 458, and in this issue is new hangers-on Outlaw Brutes. And this is a great article because it expands on Outlaw Gang's options, and it also gives the Chaos Helot Cultist group gang some new options as well. Instead of just having a Chaos spawn as a brute, they could have a Scrap Code Corrupted Ambot, a Mutated Ogren, a Warp Horror, or Sump Beast. So it's an article that this really should have been in the gang listing originally for Chaos Helot Cults. So great options in here for those. And I'm actually working on a Warp Horror right now with contents of the Ashes of Faith box. And so yeah, my other thought about this article is using a Mutated Ogren actually as a outcast gang leader. So that was something else I was going to look into, because I have a great model, and I think the rules for the Mutated Ogren would fit that model perfectly. But more on that in a future video. And that is basically issue 458. And that's it for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2, where we look at endgame scenarios, hanger-on scenarios, another mini campaign, underdog scenarios, and Badzone enforcer rules. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.